Hello hunters, and welcome back to Super Fan Natural. Monsters. They're arguably one of the most important parts of Supernatural. I mean, if you had to describe the show in about 3 words, it would have to be brothers hunting monsters. Thing is, there are a lot of monsters in the series, and it can be hard to keep track of them all. In this video, I'll do my best to list and briefly describe every species of monster that appears in the show. Buckle up, folks. This one's going to be a doozy. First, we need some clarification about classification. There's a buttload of creepy creatures in Supernatural, but not all of them qualify as monsters. In order to be a part of the Monster Squad, you gotta be descended from the mother of monsters, Eve. Eve is, complicated. All you gotta know is that she's an ancient thing from a dimension called Purgatory who came up to Earth about 10,000 years ago. During her time topside, she produced a number of children known as alphas, who would go on to spread their specific strain of monsterdom across the world in a variety of ways. If a specific species or curse can trace its origins back to Eve, then they qualify as true monsters. This disqualifies things like demons, ghosts, angels, hellhounds, fairies, witches, horsemen, pagan gods, actual god, reapers, and Lovecraftian tentacle monsters. Other creatures I won't cover here are Shoujo, Basan, Muska, Zana, Banshees, Soul Eaters, Wood Nymphs, Gorgons, Familiars, and Kareen, because while it is possible that these things are monsters, I just personally don't think they are for various reasons. I promise I'll cover each one of these things in due time, just not here. Also, here's a quick heads up. This video will include discussion of the 2 creatures listed on the screen right now. I know there's some people who don't like hearing them even named, so if that applies to you, then maybe skip the specific time codes listed. True monsters come in a variety of flavors. However, there are a few similarities between cousin species. For example, they come in all manner of shapes and sizes, but about 90% have some ability to pass as regular people, either through shapeshifting, illusions, or just retracting and hiding their monstrous qualities. They each have a variety of inhuman powers, but most are at least strong enough to easily overpower the average Joe. They're also usually a lot hardier than regular people and require special materials or methods to put them down, though super severe damage like beheading or exploding can also do the job most of the time. Also, many live longer than normal humans, and some are even functionally immortal. Finally, the reason monsters are considered, monstrous is because most of them feed on regular people in one way or another. Alright, let's actually get to the monsters. For this video, I decided to organize the various species into groups based on similar characteristics. The first group we'll tackle is the Fang Gang, so named because their key feature is a set of sharp, pointy teeth they use to get at their food source, human blood. What better fang-faced freak to start with than vampires? Vamps are the show's most reoccurring monster, and it's easy to see why. Not only are they classic, they're also kind of generic when compared to other monsters. As in most media, they're immortal blood drinkers who reproduce by infecting and turning regular people. The show's version is less Dracula and more 30 Days of Night. They don't really have any kind of shapeshifting or mind control powers, but they are superhumanly strong and fast, and their senses are among the sharpest in the verse. Also, like 30 Days of Night, they don't have just 2 itty-bitty fangs. Instead, they have a whole row of retractable mouth spikes that descend from their upper gums. Another deviation from classic lore is the mode of vampiric infection. Vampirism in Supernatural isn't transmitted through bites. Instead, it lies in the vampire blood itself, meaning that in order to turn a person, they have to be fed or injected with vamp blood. One thing that is kind of unique about this form of monster infection is that it's one of the very few that can be cured. You just have to drink a special potion, however it only works if the drinker has never fed on human blood. Taking out these vampires can be a little trickier than some myths, since you gotta chop off their head to put them down. Stakes to the heart don't do anything, and while sunlight does irritate their eyes and skin, it doesn't actually burn them, meaning that tougher vamps can freely walk amongst the waking world. They have a few other weaknesses, the most notable being blood taken from a corpse, aka dead man's blood. If this stuff gets into the vamp system, it'll weaken them quite a bit, making them much easier to deal with. Here's a little fun fact about these fanged freaks. Despite being the most common monster in the show, at the beginning of the series, they were actually endangered. In fact, they were so uncommon that Sam and Dean, 2 lifelong hunters, didn't believe in them until the end of Season 1. You may be wondering how they managed to bounce back. That was due in large part to the very first vampire, the Alpha. Big Daddy Alpha Vamp, played wonderfully by Rick Worthy, seems to have been one of the oldest monsters in existence, implying that he'd been around since the dawn of human civilization. He was also one tough bastard, as he could endure gallons of dead man's blood and electrocution without batting an eye. In addition to the regular vamp powers, The alpha could shape his nails into razor-sharp claws, and he had some level of psychic connection to his children that allowed him to coordinate the repopulation of his species. There's plenty of other little factoids that I could mention about vamps, but the last one I'll mention here is that it was a vampire which finally permanently killed Dean Winchester. But it wasn't just any vampire. No, this was a member of the most feared and deadly breed of bloodsucker. He was a
vamp mimes.
The next member of the Fang gang could very easily be mistaken for vampires. In fact, to a certain degree, Noxer seem closer to the classical vampire than the show's actual vamps. Not only do these things have more Dracula-esque fangs, they're also legitimately undead, to the point that they're one of the very few monsters in the series that can't be killed with beheading. In fact, if their head is severed, then put back onto their body, they'll heal, and they'll be good as new after a certain amount of time. The only way to truly put them down is to place a copper coin in its mouth, then chop off the head. Now, going near the mouth of any monster is risky, however, it's especially dangerous when dealing with Noxer, since they're among the races of monster that reproduce via infectious bites, meaning that if you get chomped on and survive, then there's a good chance that you too will become a German vamp ghoul thing. If that were to happen, you wouldn't be completely boned, as there is a cure for this condition. When a Noxer is killed, all the people they turned will instantly revert back to regular humans, which is oddly convenient for Supernatural. I don't know if that cures anyone that those people turned. If not, then I guess they're just screwed. Now that feels more like the show I know. The last fanged-faced fiend in this category of monster is the Vatala. These things have a passing similarity to the rest of the Fang gang. However, when you look a little deeper, you find some major differences. The biggest one is how they're made. Vatala may look like regular people, however, they've never been human. Instead, they're more like lizard people who hide reptilian eyes and teeth behind an unassuming visage. Because they aren't people who are transformed, it means they're probably born to two Vatala parents, though I guess it is possible for one of their parents to be human, since we do see that kind of thing from a few other monsters. Like vamps, Vatala feed on human blood. However, that's not their only use of their fangs. In keeping with the reptile theme, Vatala can inject their prey with venom to keep them weak and sedated, allowing them to stretch out the feeding for longer periods of time. Besides that, there really isn't much more to say about these things. We only ever saw two, and they both got killed with silver knives. Let's move on to the next group of monsters, which I have named Beasty Boys, or just beasts if you're no fun. The reason I call them that is simple. They all look human most of the time, however when their monster instincts kick in, they take on animalistic features. When talking about monsters that change from human to animal, you obviously have to start with werewolves. Right off the bat, I've got to address the biggest change the series made to its werewolves. They don't actually turn into wolves. I know, I'm as disappointed as you are. It's an interesting change, one that really kicked off the show's habit of turning monsters into people with minimal makeup. Anyway, instead of fully wolfing out, these lycans just grow sharp claws, inhuman eyes that are sometimes blue and sometimes yellow, and gnarly teeth that they use to chomp on their favorite snack, human hearts. As for when they transform, well, that depends. Unlike most monsters, there's actually two different ways to become a werewolf. Like Noxer, the curse of the werewolf can be transmitted through bites. However, there's actually two different strains of lycanthropy that can be acquired this way. The first is what you might call the involuntary strain, because it gives its victims very little control over their condition. Instead, the transformation happens automatically at night during the week of the full moon, and outside of that time frame, they don't seem to have any access to their monster powers. They don't even get to enjoy their week of wolf wackiness, as while in beast mode, they don't have any conscious control over their actions. While savage, they aren't completely mindless. A small fragment of the wolf's subconscious mind remains intact and drives them to hunt down and slaughter people they don't like. This strain of curse is supposedly the most common, however, we only see 2, maybe 3 in the entire show. The rest of the werewolves that show up are known as purebloods. Unlike the werewolves I just talked about, purebloods can actually change at will, and they retain control in monster mode. Basically, some werewolves have absolutely no control, while others have near complete control. So, what determines which one you get? It all comes down to who does the biting. The pureblood strain is carried by those who are turned within a few generations of the alpha. So basically, Eve made the alpha werewolf, who we never see by the way, then it bit some people, and those people bit other people, and then those people bit other people, and if you were bitten by any of those werewolves, then congrats, you get to be a pureblood. Everyone else, good luck. However, not all werewolves are created through bites. It is possible for 2 werewolves to produce children who are just born werewolves. We don't know much about this congenital lycanthropy since we only saw a couple examples and they all came from purebloods. Whatever their subtype, all werewolves share fatal weaknesses to silver, sulfate gas, and getting blown up. One last little fun fact for you. According to Mick Davies, it's possible for mice to contract lycanthropy. We don't actually see it, but it's very funny to think about. So the show's version of werewolves may not go full canine, but their cousin species, the skinwalkers, sure do. However, instead of turning into wolves or wolf men, these monsters can take the form of completely normal-looking dogs. It's not even one particular breed of dog. We saw 3 walkers change in the show, and each one turned into a different breed of dog. This power is both adorable and terrifying. Adorable because, dogs, but terrifying because of how insidious it can be. See, besides their transformation, skinwalkers are basically the same as pureblood werewolves. They can change at will, with full control, their bite can turn other people into skinwalkers, they're vulnerable to silver, and most importantly, they feed on human hearts. So imagine you're a kind, loving person, and you really want a dog. Eventually you find one that seems absurdly sweet and well-trained, so you take it home and it falls asleep on your bed. Then in the middle of the night, it either eats your heart or bites you, and oops, now you're permanently doomed to the eternal battlefield of purgatory when you die. It's evil in a way that I don't think Eve intended. I'm pretty sure she intended for these things to be scary because they combine the speed and savagery of a dog with the intelligence of mankind. What I want to know is, what determines a skinwalker's dog form? Do they get to pick? Is it random? If one took a BuzzFeed quiz about what kind of dog they would be it be accurate? Important questions that will never be answered. We've got one more Beastie Boy to talk about, and like the others, they keep the canine theme. Instead of turning into dogs or wolves, kitsune are supposed to represent foxes. Though, if I'm being honest, that doesn't really come through in their design. At a glance, they could easily be mistaken for a redesign of werewolves, since, like lichens, they look human until they whip out bestial eyes and claws. So a bit redundant, but at least they have a few characteristics to differentiate them from wolves. Firstly, they don't seem to be infectors. Instead, the little bit of info we get seems to indicate that they reproduce entirely through breeding, though it's not clear if they can mate with humans. Second, they feed on brains rather than hearts, which is weird but unique, I guess. The last thing that really stands out about kitsune is that they seem kind of frail. Don't get me wrong, they're still very dangerous. It's just that they don't seem as physically resilient as other monsters. The primary way of putting them down is to jab them in the heart, though it doesn't seem like you need to use any kind of special material to do it. A regular knife will work. They also don't seem capable of substituting human gray matter for an animal-based alternative, which is a problem because they can apparently get dangerously sick without a steady diet of fresh brains. I don't know, to me these things have always been one of the lamest monsters in the series, which is a shame considering how cool kitsune are in real-world Shinto lore. So, thus far, all the monsters we've covered have relied heavily on their physical abilities to overpower their prey. This next group is made up of species that, while still predatory, use more interesting methods for their monster mayhem. I call them the Tricky Terrors, and there's no better place to start than with the trickiest monster in the show, shapeshifters. I've made an entire video about these things, so to cut down on the length of this one, I'm going to be a bit brief. Shifters are interesting monsters, but not hard ones to understand. As the name suggests, their whole shtick is taking the form of various people in order to impersonate them so that they can... Well, actually, it really depends on the individual shifter. Shapeshifters are one of the very few monsters that don't seem to feed on humans in any way. There are a few hints that some shifters might eat people, but most of what we actually see from them suggests that they don't have a biological need to prey on humans. So then why do some of them end up as murderers or bank robbers? Well, for the same reason as regular people. Some are just evil, crazy, or desperate. Really, the only reason a shifter would absolutely need to interact with humans is to reproduce, since these particular monsters are born from the hot, sexy union of a female human and a male, presenting shifter. We don't know if shifters in a female shape can get pregnant, nor if two shifters can reproduce together, though that last one would be a bit awkward since all shapeshifters are biologically related as descendants of their alpha. Like some other monsters, there seems to be two different breeds of shapeshifter, distinguished from each other by their method of transformation. Most shifters change by reshaping their anatomy, then ripping off their skin to reveal a new form underneath. However, there are a few that can quick change via CGI blur effect. This doesn't get explained. However, considering the fact that the alpha shifter could also blur into new forms, it seems real likely that, like pureblood werewolves, quick shifters are more closely related to the alpha, possibly being his kids, grandkids, or great-grandkids. Regardless of their power, all shifters are vulnerable to silver, as well as the extremely rare metal iridium. Also, for some reason, their presence upset dogs, which in my opinion is their absolute worst quality. The next tricky terror is one that can make all of your wildest dreams come true. That would be the ever-tricky Jinn. Unlike real-world Islamic lore, supernatural Jinn aren't spiritual beings. Instead, they're physical monsters who look like regular people until they reveal their glowing blue eyes and sick full-body tattoos. Still, they are one of the more magical monster species. This is because, while they don't actually grant wishes, they can give you the illusion of all your wishes being granted. Jinn have the power to induce vivid, dreamlike hallucinations in their victims, which puts them into an incredibly deep sleep, allowing the monster to freely feed on their blood. While napping, the victim's mind is trapped in a kind of dream world where one of their deepest wishes has come true, though they don't necessarily get a perfect fantasy. For example, in Dean's Jinn world, his mom wasn't killed, meaning that he and his family didn't become hunters and instead lived good, normal lives. On the flip side, monsters still existed, and since the Winchesters never went hunting, it meant that everyone they would have saved died. It really doesn't seem like Jinn have much control over what their victims see. I mean, maybe they do, but if so, I don't think the one that captured Dean would put himself into the dream. No, it seems like all they do is supply the magical, hallucinogenic poison, which is secreted from their hands and absorbed into the target's skin via touch. When using this poison, a Jinn's hand will look like it's engulfed in ethereal blue flames, and while this fire or vapor doesn't seem to physically burn the target, it does look really cool. We see two variations of the Jinn's usual poison power. However, it's not clear if all Jinn can use them. First, there was one group of Jinn that could secrete a toxin that didn't actually sedate its victims. Instead, it would induce extreme paranoia and waking nightmares, and eventually the target's heart would give out. Later, we saw another group of Jinn use a different fear-based venom, one that did put its victims under, but trapped them in an endless loop of nightmares. These fear Jinn were described as, quote, bastard offshoots, but it's kind of hard to tell if that means they're a subspecies or just a particular faction. What we do know is that Jinn can be killed with knives dipped in lamb's blood, which is weirdly specific. Jinn may not necessarily be the worst monsters to be killed by, but nonetheless, as the great Angus Scrimm once said, fear one thing, fear the Jinn. The next tricky terror is one of the creepiest monsters in the series, at least to me. They also have one of the coolest names, Wraith. Wraiths are vampiric aliens from the Pegasus Galaxy, wrong show. Though honestly, the Wraiths that Sam and Dean hunt do share some qualities with the ones that plague Atlantis. Like most monsters, they look perfectly human. However, when viewed using a mirror or psychic powers, their face appears rotten and corpse-like. I don't think we ever saw one drop the human visage, so I'm not sure if the zombie face is their true form or just a reflection of their monster nature or something. Like Kitsune, these things feed on human brains, though instead of chomping down on them, they suck out the juices using a gnarly bone spike they keep hidden in their wrist. The reason I put them in this category is that, like Jinn, they secrete a toxin that is used to subdue their victims. Wraith poison doesn't sedate the target, instead it destabilizes their brain chemistry, leading to psychotic behavior and hallucinations. This insanity makes it likely that the victim will be isolated, cast out, or confined by society, and even if they realize that they're being hunted by a monster, who's gonna believe them? The good news is that they aren't the strongest monsters, and all you gotta do to take them out is poke them with a bit of silver. We don't really know how wraiths reproduce. There's nothing to suggest that they turn people, so I guess they're probably breeders. But then I have to ask, does the baby come out looking like this? That's enough to actually break your brain. I'll cap off this grouping with one of the most insidious species of monster in the show. As a great wise man once said, "The true warrior attacks neither the body nor the mind. It's the heart, Osborne. Go for the heart." And when it comes to metaphorically attacking the heart, there are a few creatures that can stack up to the sirens. Like classical mythology, supernatural sirens are hideous creatures who use a kind of song to draw in and manipulate people. However, unlike the old legends, the show's sirens don't use a literal song. Instead, they spit venom that scrambles a person's brain, causing them to become obsessively infatuated with the creature. This gives the siren an incredible amount of control over their victim, to the point that they can convince them to commit murder. To complement their chemical control, sirens can read a target's mind in order to find out their ideal companion, and then they use some kind of shape-shifting to hide their hideous, bald, gray, alien-looking true form behind a disguise that is specifically tailored for the victim. I don't actually know if they physically change or if they use some kind of illusion. Whatever the case, their real face is visible in mirrors. One thing that makes sirens kind of interesting is that they don't just manipulate people with romantic or sexual feelings. There are some that are willing to prey on people who crave relationships based on trust or friendship. So what does the siren get out of all this? According to the only one we ever saw, it was basically addicted to the feeling of fresh love. They lived for the honeymoon phase of a relationship. You know, when everything is new and exciting, it's the best feeling in the world. However, they would eventually get bored and ghost their current victim in order to find someone new to hit up. The only way to break a siren's hold on someone is to slay the creature using a bronze dagger coated in the blood of one of its current victims. I don't really know if sirens feed off of humans in a physical sense. We don't see one actually eat people, but maybe they're sustained by a chaotic love life? At the beginning of this video, I told you that most monsters eat people in one way or another. And by now, you've seen examples of creeps that crave blood, brains, hearts, or just meat in general. These next two monsters are grouped together as gastric nightmares due to their unique diets. We'll start with a creature that I personally find to be one of the least threatening in the series.
Ghouls.
Yes, ghouls, aka grave gobblers. As you may have guessed by that stupid nickname I just made up, these things are corpse eaters. They feed on dead bodies to survive. That's extremely disrespectful, but it means that they don't really have to mess with the living, which is why most monsters end up on hunting radar. Now, some ghouls do prey on living people for one reason or another, and when that happens, things can get a little weird thanks to their shape-shifting ability. See, ghouls don't have a fixed appearance. Instead, they take the form of the last person they fed on. This isn't the most useful power, but it can be used in some pretty messed up ways. For example, the first ghoul in the show got close to the Winchesters by secretly killing, eating, and impersonating their half-brother Adam. Beyond their weird morphing power, ghouls only really have their strength and durability to rely on. To be fair, they are pretty hardy. Their head has to be removed or destroyed in order to put them down, but I don't know, I still can't help but find these guys kinda lame. Alright, so this next monster might sound pretty stupid at first, but bear with me, I promise they're more interesting than ghouls. They're called Pishtako, and if you're wondering why they have such a weird name, it's because these things aren't from North America or Europe. Instead, they're mostly found in South America, though it is a little weird that more haven't migrated to the US considering their diet. See, instead of feasting on flesh, blood, or bone, Pishtako survive off of fat. Not fatty meat, I mean actual fat, adipose tissue, the fatty filling that forms flab. They literally suck the fat out of people's bodies using a creepy suction tube in their throats that, in a bit of Zelda logic, acts as one of their major weak points. Like cutting this thing off with a silver knife actually kills them. So many of you are probably thinking that these guys seem like the dumbest monsters ever. Like, oh no, I'm so scared of their dinky little throat leech. Please don't give me free liposuction. And you'd have a point, if not for the fact that a pissed off Pishtako can reduce a person to literal skin and bones in about a minute. This is beyond horrifying and definitely makes them a genuine threat to humanity, though they don't have to be. See, Pishtako can control the rate of suction, and they're completely capable of taking an amount of fat that's safe or even healthy from a human. So, in a hypothetical world where obesity is a rising problem, I feel it would be totally possible for monster and man to form a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship. And I'm not alone in that. The show itself acknowledges that possibility. The only Pishtako we saw in the show ran a weight loss spa, and while one of the pair was covertly killing people, the other wasn't. She was genuinely trying to use her powers for the good of mankind. Moving on from gastric nightmares, let's talk about two of the rarest species of monster in the world. In fact, these rare fiends are so uncommon, they were considered myths by some of the most seasoned and well-traveled hunters. To start, we've got a creature that I definitely didn't expect from a show where everything looks human.
Dragons.
Yeah, Supernatural has dragons, and in true Supernatural fashion, they look like regular people. Okay, that's not entirely true. Their human form is just a disguise. They apparently do have a more draconic true form hidden under there somewhere. We don't get to see it. The most we get are glimpses of claws and wings, and an illustration in a questionably canon book, the Men of Letters Bestiary. So, visually, they're a bit lame. However, they do at least have some dragon powers. In addition to flight, they're incredibly strong and can superheat their hands to the point of liquefying metal. We don't see them breathe fire, but it's hinted that they can, and honestly, I think the decision to not show it was made in order to spare us a wonky effect, which is probably a good call. Dragons are also some of the hardest monsters to slay, as the only weapons known to hurt them are magical swords made from dragon blood. Dragons also seem to have a much stronger connection to Eve, as she was somehow able to communicate with a group of them from purgatory. So yeah, there's a lot to criticize about the show's treatment of dragons, but at least they carry a little bit of gravitas. The next rare fiend got a very similar treatment to dragons, in that it's a traditionally flaming flying fantasy creature that was reimagined to be a regular looking person. So if you don't like the way the show handled dragons, then you probably won't like its version of a phoenix. We only saw one phoenix, and didn't really get all that much information about him. He never turned into a bird, and while he did crumble into ashes upon death, there was nothing to suggest that he would be reborn from those ashes. He did have the ability to incinerate people with a touch, and even then, he was one of the very rare monsters that was willing to use firearms. The most interesting thing about the phoenix is that its ashes are Eve's kryptonite. They're the only thing known to kill her, and she's so allergic to them that even a small amount in someone's bloodstream could be fatal if ingested. Between that and the fact that the phoenix didn't seem to eat people, it's very easy to believe that he and his kind weren't created by Eve, but according to the official companion to Season 6, they totally were, and because of their toxic relationship with Mother, they were shunned and hunted by the rest of monsterdom. So it's all about the ashes, baby, but how one would get said remains is not entirely clear. Like other monsters, phoenixes can tank mundane murder methods like bullets and hanging, and since they're so rare, there really isn't any lore about ganking them. Dean took one out with the Colt, so at the very least we know that they're not one of the 5 things immune to the magic gun. Honestly, as much as I don't like the design of the phoenix, I feel like it has a very interesting place in the lore of the show, so let me know if you guys would be interested in a video all about them. By this point, I'm sure some of you are tired of hearing about monsters that look mostly, if not entirely, human. So, then good news. The next grouping is composed of creatures that actually look monstrous all the time. As such, I call these the Perma freaks. We'll start with the very first monster to appear in the show, the Wendigo. Actually, in the show they're referred to as Wendigos, but this is my channel, so I'm going to use the pronunciation that I've heard from other sources. Anyways, instead of looking like regular folks, Wendigos have gray skin, long gangly limbs, sharp teeth and claws, and a hideous goblin-looking face. Due to their grotesque appearance, as well as the fact that they eat people, Wendigos forego civilized society and instead make their homes in isolated stretches of the wilderness, where they sleep and wait patiently for fresh human meat. Physically, these things are incredibly dangerous. They're insanely fast, can mimic voices, and are highly resistant to damage from anything besides fire. They're pretty much the textbook definition of monster, which is a bit ironic since there's an argument to be made that they might not qualify for Supernatural's definition of monster. According to the lore, Wendigos are made from humans who commit cannibalism, and I don't know how that would connect back to Eve. I don't know, I'm pretty sure they're meant to be descended from her. I just wanted to bring that up, especially since we did see a similar cannibal creature who was made using magic instead of whatever the hell Eve is. The next perma-freak is known as a Rougarou, and while its name is fun to say, these things have an extremely tragic and messed up life cycle. A big part of the tragedy comes from the fact that they start out seeming to be completely human, to the point that they themselves may not know what they truly are. Around the age of 30, a Rougarou will begin a monstrous transformation that comes with shifting bones, sharpening of senses, and most importantly, an inhuman appetite. Initially, they're overcome by insane cravings for red meat. However, that eventually shifts to a desire for human meat. Now, at this point, they still look human, and as long as they never chow down on people, that won't change. However, just one bite of man meat, and they're irreversibly changed into a veiny, gray-skinned freak. In this form, they retain their human intelligence, but are completely consumed by their hunger, and like Wendigos, they've got to be torched with sweet, cleansing fire. If all that isn't horrible enough, then here's one more little tidbit. Like shifters, Rougarou reproduce by breeding with humans. However, while it's almost certain that a shifter will know what they are and what they're doing, the same can't be said for Rougarou. It's very possible for one to think it's just a regular person making a regular baby, blissfully unaware that they're actually bringing a life into the world that will one day have its perceived humanity violently ripped away. Alright, I got one more perma-freak to talk about, and here's a warning to all the arachnophobes watching. We're talking about spider people. They're called arachni, and in all honesty, they don't look all that spidery. They look mostly human, which is probably because at one point they were, until the day they were bitten and turned by an existing arachni. The change doesn't happen immediately, but once it's finished, the newly made monster is left with wrinkled skin and these bizarre multi-pupil eyes. Unfortunately, they don't get any extra limbs, however they do get the ability to generate webbing from somewhere. I also like to think that they can crawl on walls. We don't see that, but come on, they're spider people. The only known way to put them down is beheading. We actually see that even arachne that haven't fully changed can walk off damage from headshots and fire. Besides that, we just don't know much about them, mostly because they haven't been seen since ancient Crete. In my opinion, this is the species whose alpha I want to see the most. I mean, it's gotta be an actual spider person, right? My headcanon is that she's the arachne from Greek myth, changed by Eve into a grotesque 8-legged spider queen. Before we finish up with the last group of monsters, I want to quickly talk about a few creatures that aren't confirmed to be descendants of Eve, but who could be. First, there's the Striga, a supposed Albanian witch who sucks the life force out of kids. Supernatural has a few different types of witches, and this thing doesn't act like any of them, which makes me think it could actually be a monster. It also looks like one and is vulnerable to iron, further supporting my point. Next, there's the Rakshasa, a shape-shifting freak who feeds on people who let it into their house. It can also turn invisible, and the only thing that can gank it is brass. And to me, that all seems monster-like. The whole needs to be invited in thing is a little strange, but hey, sometimes monsters have weird quirks. Next, there's the changelings. These things come from fairy lore, but to me, they definitely seem way more monster-like. Groups of these leech-mouthed little freak will infiltrate parts of human society to kidnap and impersonate children in order to feed on the parents' blood. I don't know, maybe they really are fairies, but you can't tell me that they don't sound more like monsters. They're also vulnerable to fire, which is not something we see from other fairies. Next, there's the Crocata, a snaggletooth soul sucker who mimics voices and manipulates people into taking their own lives. I'll be honest, I don't really know what these things are. Maybe they're monsters, but it would be weird that they eat souls since no other monsters do that. Next, we've got the Okami, which just looks like a person with big fangs. We don't know anything about them except that they're native to Japan, and to kill them you gotta stab them 7 times with a blessed bamboo dagger. Or just throw them into a wood chipper, that works too. Finally, there's Cole Trenton's dad, who apparently was some kind of liver-eating monster. He looked completely human, but apparently he wasn't, and Dean had to take him out with a silver dagger. It doesn't seem like his son Cole inherited his monster genes, which would make this one of the very few creature-human unions that produced a completely human kid. To finish off this video, we've got a group that I've dubbed the modern monsters, because unlike the rest of this list, these things aren't thousands or even hundreds of years old. Instead, each one of these species was created in 2011 when Eve came to Earth in order to stop Cass and Crowley. During her business trip, she crafted these new breeds of monster in order to find the perfect creature to corrupt the Earth. Her first project was the smallest and most inhuman monster in the show, the conworm, so named because it's literally a worm. This pesky parasite could crawl into people's ears and take over their body, kind of like a yerk or a goa'uld. It was basically a form of possession, and like other body snatchers, the worm could make its vessel super strong and keep it going after fatal damage. Its only weakness was electricity. It would willingly escape from bodies that were shocked, and it was ultimately killed when it couldn't escape Bobby's electrified meat suit. There seems to only have been one conworm, which I guess would make it an alpha. There was another parasitic worm later in the series, however, I don't think it's actually related to the conworm since it acted completely different. Instead of possessing people, it would jump into their bodies and dry them out until they were so thirsty they would willingly feed on human blood. I don't know if this water worm was even a monster, but if so, here's its mention. For her next trick, Eve turned a guy named Ed into what I can only describe as a reverse shapeshifter. Instead of Ed turning into other people, he would cause other people to turn into him, clothes and all. He didn't have any control over his ability, instead it acted more like an infection that he spread unintentionally. This condition was unstable, so eventually Ed and the 6 or so people he transformed just kind of burned up and died of a fever. The next modern monstrosity Eve brought into the world were some of the most unique creatures in the show because they were based off of a concept that nobody has ever imagined ever before: hybrids. Yes, Eve decided to give her test subjects the powers of multiple monsters, resulting in hybrids known as Jefferson Starships. I'm not joking, that's actually their name. Thanks, Dean. The starships that we saw had vampire fangs, a wraith spike, and eyes that gave off retinal flares like shapeshifters, though I'm not sure if they could actually transform. Personally, I would have thrown in a few more features, like Jin tattoos and werewolf claws, but whatever, this is fine, I guess. Despite being kinda cool, they don't seem to have been much stronger than regular monsters, and they could be murked with beheading or angelic smiting. By the end of their debut episode, it seems like all the starships had been wiped out. It is possible that some had already left the town, but we never see them again, so probably not. Man, I still can't get over their name. The only thing I know about the actual band, the Jefferson Starships, is that they played a song in the universally beloved Star Wars holiday special. After a lot of experimentation, Eve managed to turn a little boy named Ryan into a creature that she referred to as the perfect monster. Hearing that, you probably think this thing is going to be some kind of unstoppable behemoth armed to the teeth with powers and horrific features. Well, actually, it's quite the opposite. Ryan's new form was so subtle and minimal that 3 of the most well-trained hunters couldn't suss out that he wasn't human, and believe me, they checked. He was allegedly screened using every method known to the Winchesters and Bobby, and nothing came up positive, meaning that he was effectively immune to things like iron and silver. In a sense, this was the most perfect encapsulation of Supernatural's approach to monsters, a monster with no monster qualities, though in this case, it actually kind of made sense. The reason Eve considered this to be perfect is because of its ability to slip past hunters. See, these perfect monsters could turn other people through bites, and since there's no way to really test who's been turned, they essentially carry an asymptomatic superinfection that could spread through the world and condemn all of humanity to purgatory, since, again, that's where all monsters go after death. They were essentially made to poison all of the souls on Earth as retribution against Cass and Crowley, who had been capturing and torturing monsters to try and find a way into purgatory. Ryan, who I guess was technically an alpha, managed to turn his brother and maybe their uncle before Crowley and his demons showed up and I guess ripped their hearts out? Whatever they did, it killed the only 2 or 3 perfect monsters in the world, thus bringing the newest monster species to extinction. And that, my friends, brings this monster of a video to an end. I hope you enjoyed it. I know there's plenty of creatures that weren't on the list, but like I said before, I promise that I'll cover each and every one eventually. You guys should follow me on Twitter. I don't think that I'll post there very much, but it's a nice way for me to keep in touch with you guys if something were to happen to this channel. You can find the handle in the description for this channel, along with an email address that you can use to send me video ideas if there's any specific topics you want to see covered. I'll have more for you next month, but for now, carry on,